So, first of all, good morning, and thank you for coming to this panel. I know we're up against Ed Redkosh's panel this morning, so I'm very pleased that so many of you could come. I'm Helen Rogers. I'm from the law firm Allen & Overy, and I'm the moderator on the panel this morning. The workshop's about war and peace. Nothing to do with Tolstoy, so don't run away. It's all right. Everything to do with international law and the rule of law, which, of course, I would say is way more interesting than Tolstoy. Anyway, so we've been hearing throughout the forum about the ways in which we might be able to respond to the refugee crisis. And this workshop, I suppose, goes back to the source of the crisis rather than looking at projects that deal with the effect. So, yeah, we're looking at ways that projects have been trying to deal with the cause of what's going on. I'd like to give you a couple of statistics to start. It's always a good way to start. But they do really highlight the scale of the problem. And the first is from the UNHCR, which estimates that more than 50 million people are now either refugees or internally displaced because of conflict and violence. And this is the highest number since the end of the Second World War. Secondly, this year's Global Peace Index from the Institute for Economics and Peace put the economic impact of violence on the global economy last year at $14.3 trillion, which is 13.4% of world GDP. And just to say, that's the equivalent of the combined economies of Brazil, Canada, France, Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom. So we're facing a pretty big problem. And I think if pro bono could do anything to try to reduce those statistics, then that would clearly be a very good thing. So we're going to be looking this morning at projects that focus on Syria, Liberia, and Rwanda, and on a new evidence-gathering project that's going to support lawyers bringing international war crime prosecutions. The panel will share their experiences of working with pro bono lawyers on different projects, and they'll highlight the issues that come up when you're dealing with a political landscape that's sometimes volatile and also constantly changing. We'll also look at projects that are taking place both during and post-conflict. So we have three wonderful experts on the panel this morning. They'll talk to you about their work, and we hope it will really give you food for thought to develop your own projects when you come out of here. So enough from me. I'd like to introduce, starting on my far left, Mark Latimer, who is the director of the Ceasefire Centre for Civilian Rights, which promotes civilian-led monitoring of violations in armed conflict and also accountability for abuses of the rights of civilians. Whilst at Amnesty International, Mark worked on the Pinochet case, and at Minority Rights Group International on the first Congo cases before the ICC. Wendy Betts, to my left here, is the director of Eyewitness to Atrocities at the International Bar Association. Wendy has 20 years' experience in international development, rule of law reform, and transitional justice. She previously served as a director of the IBA War Crimes Documentation Project. And in the middle, Susan Hazeldine, who's director of the International Senior Lawyers Project UK, an NGO that specialises in advising civil society and governments on key development, human rights, and rule of law via their network of pro bono lawyers. Susan has over 20 years' experience as well as a litigator, and that includes 14 years as a partner at Allen & Overy. So, in the usual way, we're going to use a Q&A format, and we really want this panel to be informative, but also practical. So, please do ask questions as we go, and share any comments or war stories that you have of your own. We'd be really delighted to hear them. And just to say, don't wait to the end, because we are really quite short on time today, so please interact as we go. Actually, to that end, could I just get a sense of who's in the room? Law firms, if you could put your hands up. Okay, thank you. And in-house counsel? Nope. NGOs? Thank you. And academics? Okay, I think that's helpful. Great. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask the same question to all the panellists. So, starting with Mark. Mark, could you tell us how you've been working with pro bono lawyers to advance your work?
Well, thank you very much, Helen, for that introduction. I personally have worked with pro bono lawyers for a long time, for about 15 years in various organisations on various projects. I think it's worth saying that in relation to conflict, there is a tendency sometimes to think, particularly if the conflict is really bad or a really protracted situation, that we give up on the normal ways of interacting in society, including in terms of using the law. And that actually isn't the experience of most societies in conflict. They continue to function on some level, and that includes in terms of legal relationships. The current project that I'm working on with Helen and her colleagues at Allen and Overy is on Syria. Now there you have a country which is probably more profoundly in conflict than any other in the world today. So much has broken down. So the question you're going to ask is, well, can law, can legal services help? The project that we're engaged in is about trying to promote some form of accountability for gross abuses committed during the conflict. Now, that's quite a high challenge. It has to be said that one of the reasons why the situation in Syria is so bad, apart from the fact that a number of countries are piling in at the moment, is because there is no accountability for atrocity on any side in the conflict. So we're working on a project to try and promote accountability extraterritorially, so in other jurisdictions, for those who commit very serious atrocities within Syria. So mostly Syrians, but also possibly foreign nationals. Now, for a project like that, where we're looking at potentially cases in a number of jurisdictions, up to 7 European jurisdictions, maybe also in North America, it's very difficult for a small organisation, for an NGO like mine, to try and take on something of that magnitude. And having pro bono services from a law firm, it has to be said, I know that not all law firms have the international footprint of a law firm like Allen and Overy, but that kind of reach is hugely beneficial. We wouldn't be able to do it without it. And it also means that, that really dedicated legal work, feasibility work first off on the possibility of extraterritorial prosecutions has taken place. And the lawyers working on it, I think, have an insight or gain an insight into some of the issues around, the legal issues around the Syrian conflict, without necessarily having to travel to Syria, which might be a disincentive in some cases.
Thank you, Mark. Wendy, the same question to you. So you've been doing a lot of work, I understand, with DLA Piper in the research and development of the Eyewitness application.
Yes, absolutely. So the IBA, through the Eyewitness Project, developed a mobile camera app that can be used to video or photograph information relevant to atrocity crimes, so in this case in particular war crimes. And the idea was to embed sufficient information to facilitate the authentication and admissibility of this footage in court. So it arose in response to the footage you were starting to see regularly appearing on social media coming out of conflict zones. And while this footage was important for raising awareness of what was going on in these areas, there was very little use to actual investigations or trials or holding the perpetrators accountable, in particular because there was key bits of information about the footage that we just didn't know. And so, as you can imagine, in setting out to design this app, the key piece of information we needed to know at the outset were the admissibility standards and what information would investigators and courts need to see about a piece of footage in order to authenticate it, even in the absence of the person who took the video. So this is where we partnered with DLA, and this research was crucial. So they looked across various jurisdictions at admissibility standards. So we had the international tribunals, the hybrid courts, regional courts, and various national jurisdictions from different legal traditions. This research included case law, also consultations with former staff of each of those institutions, and this really founded the design of the app. So we coded everything within the app around the information that we received back from this research. And it was an ongoing process, as you can imagine. These standards are evolving with the notion of citizen-captured video and how it fits in with the court. We've designed the app over the course of 3 years, so this was regular ongoing updates and consultation. One other thing I would mention, in addition to providing the app, we are also maintaining a permanent repository of all the footage that is collected. And so, as you can imagine, again, this raises a host of privacy issues. There were patent issues, there's defamation issues. There was a series of other policy questions on which we needed guidance. And so here, too, DLA played a very important role looking at what the privacy defamation issues would be, what what the feasibility would be. We also had some help here from Taylor Wessing in crafting the user agreement, privacy policy, those types of components.
Great, thank you. Susan, I know you do a lot of work in rule of law projects. Do you want to tell us about a particular one that you've been focusing on recently?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, first of all, there's 4 of us all based in the UK, and so why would we know most about conflict? Well, my favourite stat is that out of the 193 countries that are currently UN members, the UK have fought conflicts in 171 of them, so I feel it's payback time. International Senior Lawyers Project has worked in around 80 countries, and I would say of those 80 countries, a significant number are countries that have experienced recent conflict, and they're peculiarly fragile. I mean, I think a nice balance, actually, because we're looking at what do you do in the middle of a conflict, what do you do to follow up on a conflict, but actually, how do you rebuild an economy that has been totally destroyed by conflict? And how do you move beyond? I mean, a lot of these conflicts are civil wars as well. So, the problems don't just disappear overnight. It's not like there's a retreating army and they've now left. People are having to live side by side with people who perpetrated crimes during that period of conflict. So, to pick one of the countries that we've done a lot of work in is Liberia. Western African country, suffered 14 years pretty much, with a bit of a break in the middle, but civil war. Charles Taylor was a rather infamous individual, brought to trial afterwards, which was fantastic. But Liberia itself was devastated by the conflict, financially devastated. GDP dropped by 95% during the first civil war. And they didn't really start from a very high level anyway. So what can we do as lawyers? And I think sometimes when people think about criminal trials, or as a corporate lawyer, perhaps not best suited to help in those, there are actually masses of ways in which as corporate lawyers you can help to rebuild an economy. I was looking at our list of projects in Liberia. We've been working there since 2007. So my theme of long-term investment, so you get to know different people in the country. Some of the projects we've done in the last 12 months, we're working with the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Revenue Authorities, the National Investment Commission, the Ministry of Justice, the National Oil Company, the Ministry of Mines. That's all government work. We've also been supporting civil society. There's lots of palm oil abuse in the country. There's so much that people can do, and all of those projects, as I will expand on later, require commercial skills. So don't just sort of turn off and kind of go, conflict, I can't possibly do anything there. There are a myriad of ways in which we can help countries rebuild their economies and get back stability.
Thank you. So, I mean, Susan, you touched on working with the Ministry of Mines, and I can imagine for a lot of the law firms in this room, that might present some problems in terms of conflicts. I'd be really interested to hear from the panel about the challenges of working with pro bono lawyers in an area of law that is highly political, and for firms that have a very big geographic footprint, what that can mean. Mark, do you want to take that one first, please?
Yes, I mean, I think, pro bono law firms who do pro bono work obviously will have the concerns about conflicts of interest working in some jurisdictions. I mean, just in terms of Syria, you think, well, actually, that might not present too many problems. But when you just think for a moment that there are some 20 states actively involved in supporting the war on one side or another, I mean, actively involved as belligerents, plus tens of others who, to some extent... Thanks. Plus tens of others who, to some extent, are involved in supporting the campaign against ISIS, I think you'll see that there are potentials for conflicts of interest. And human rights cases, generally, you're suing the state. That's what you're doing. And although some states, remarkably few actually, some states pretend that they don't mind or that they think this is part of being in a free society, other states really do mind, and they will try and take it out on people who are involved. And sometimes it can get quite, it can get very, very political. For a minority rights group, I was involved in a big case against Bosnia before the European Court of Human Rights, the Sejdic and Finci case. And we took Bosnia to court because of their refusal to allow some minority members of society to stand for the presidency. It was actually not allowed under the Dayton constitution of the country. Now, we won a very, very strong victory at Strasbourg, but Bosnia has been very slow at implementing that. And it's got to the stage now that the European Union withheld £53 million worth of international assistance because of their non-implementation of this court case. So it's become very, very political. And I think in certain circumstances like that, it might be understandable that some law firms are going to say, well, actually, I'm not sure we can help. So I think, you have to bear that in mind.
And have you found any ways to overcome that in your work?
Well, I think we've had some pro bono support in Bosnia, but it's from a law firm that was working in the region but didn't have a lot of work in the country. So, one can find ways around it, yeah. But I think one has to be aware of the potential for conflicts of interest.
Thank you. Wendy, so you've highlighted the project that you're working on. I can imagine there are quite a few issues around challenges of working with law firms in an area that involves such traumatic imagery. Do you want to say how you might be addressing that?
Sure. So we also have some of the same sensitivities of political conflicts and business conflicts. But one area that I think is really particular to our project is this notion of dealing with traumatic imagery. And our intention as we're moving into the data collection phase is to put together a permanent standing roster of pro bono attorneys who can help us review the footage as it comes in. And so human rights footage coming out of these conflict zones is quite graphic often, and it's difficult for anyone to look at, but particularly for individuals whose area of practice may not expose them to these type of images on a regular basis. So we have been looking into what policies we can put into place to minimize the impact of this. One is actually putting together the pro bono roster, because that will allow us to minimize the amount of footage that any one individual has to look at. The other ways that we can approach it is putting together, for example, checklists so that one person is looking for one thing in every image, so they don't have to absorb the entirety of what they're looking at. So, for example, one person's task may be to only look to see if there's a license plate in each piece of footage. The environment in which the footage is being viewed can affect you, so making sure that we're positioning these individuals next to a window, around other people, various methods along those lines to try and address what can be a very serious secondary or vicarious trauma issue.
Right. Susan, you're used to sending lawyers to dangerous places, I assume. How have you overcome the challenges that law firms must say to you, well, frankly, that sounds very interesting, but really I'm not going to put my banking lawyers out in Liberia. What are you going to do about that?
I point out how dangerous working in corporate law is, and,
That's
getting them out of the office would be nice for them for a day, even if it is a war zone. No, I mean, we have to be really careful of our volunteers. The reality is that a lot of work can be done remotely. You don't actually have to be in country. Or you can come up with alternative strategies. I mean, we were trying to do some work in Somalia. Well, we weren't really going to send our volunteers into Somalia, but you can run training in neighbouring countries. We were planning to run some training in the UK, and we were told that none of the Somalian government officials who would come for the training would go back, so we couldn't do that. we had to choose somewhere pretty unappealing to have the training if we were going to do it. So you have to think about different sides of that. Ironically, you were talking about conflicts. The sort of conflicts we often deal with in terms of challenges is actually commercial conflicts. So, if we're trying to do work with the Ministry of Mines, I remember in Sierra Leone, we were trying to get some advice about a mine that was going bust. And 16 law firms, I think, expressed an interest, and then they all came back and said, oh no, we have a conflict. I'm kind of, there are only 2 mines in Sierra Leone in this area. You know, how many people can you be representing? I mean, so part of our job is to understand where there may be challenges for a commercial firm to work. Usually any project has a number of elements to it, and so we try to isolate the areas which we think are uncontentious, unproblematic, so that people can, so that law firms can perhaps undertake those aspects, and then maybe we have an in-country element or something that's a little more controversial, and then we'll use independent lawyers for those, thereby avoiding all conflict. So it enables us to take on these broader projects. But no, so the safety question, I mean, recently we're doing anti-corruption work in Malawi, and one of our contacts there was murdered, and because he was associated with this group who were trying to prosecute senior former government ministers. And, you know, we take that kind of thing very seriously, so we got independent advice as to, I mean, Malawi is not an unsafe country, to be frank, but safety of volunteers in country is something we have to make paramount.
I want to just abuse my position as moderator for a moment and just talk about a project that ANO worked on in Rwanda for about 8 years. And back in 2009, a High Court judge was sent to Rwanda on behalf of ISLP, funnily enough, and he was there to assess the legal system in the aftermath of the genocide. And it sort of snowballed, and some associates became involved with his work and helping him research the situation, and it led to a much broader project that went on for many years, mainly around capacity building and training of the judiciary. But at one point, well, actually I should say that the reason why we got involved was after 1994 genocide, there were about 8 lawyers left in Rwanda, and all its courts were destroyed or abandoned, and the rule of law was pretty much extinguished. There was just not a lot in terms of rule of law. But about a couple of years into the project, we were, everything was going well. We were sending lawyers out there quite regularly to do training, and then there was media reports coming through that a number of European countries were suspending aid to Rwanda because there were reports that the government had been involved in conflict in the DRC, just over the border. There were allegations of unlawful detention and torture in the military justice system. And of course, you know, for a big law firm like ours, it was, well, gosh, you know, what on earth are we going to do? Do we just sort of stop the project? But actually, we have a lot of commitments to that region now. You know, we're very invested with the people we're working with and our partners. And I think to draw out the point here is that the importance of networks. So because we were really well connected in Rwanda at that time, we were able to speak to local stakeholders, to the Rwandan High Commission in London, to the Ministry of Justice, as well as reading all the kind of relevant data that was out there from the UN. And as a result of that, we decided to continue the project, slightly nervously, I have to say, but it was fine. And I think the reason we continued it was that we were seeking to offer the local stakeholders a critical friend. That was our position as much as anything. And we had an obligation to fulfill that. So it carried on, and actually we finished the project last year. So there was a sustainable position in place by the time we left. So that's me. I just wanted to draw on the audience at this point. I mean, do you have any examples or any comments, questions for the panel about what you've heard so far? I'd be very interested. Thank you. Just shout, Joe.
We may be working with them in some way, but I don't really remember at the moment. But a question, sir, for you, Mark. Can you describe exactly what it is you're doing now in Syria to try to identify the atrocities that you, I gather, ultimately want to prosecute?
Straight away?
Yes, yeah, do take it. Mark.
Well, interestingly, Syria is, I think about it as a sort of a real turning point in the history of human rights, because the traditional methods of monitoring and documenting violations of rights are useless in Syria because there is no access for international monitors. People just are not going, UN special rapporteurs and so on and so forth don't have access to most of Syria. But national activists are coming up with very detailed documentary evidence, often at great risk. I mean, the leader of one of or the founder of one of the main groups was assassinated a few weeks ago at great risk. But this huge store of documentation is actually coming out. We're working with one NGO which holds the main international documentation store for violations information which is coming out of Syria. So then what do you do with that information? Well, the traditional thing is to sit on it until there is a democratic transition. But then, of course, in Syria, that's looking increasingly a long way off. And indeed, if there is going to be a transition, it's now looking less likely it's going to be a transition to what is recognizably a democracy. So the question is, can you do justice? Can you do some form of accountability now? And one of the methods that we're looking at is this question about extraterritorial prosecutions or indeed civil litigation. So prosecuting Syrians mostly, but also foreign fighters who commit crimes in Syria, but prosecuting them in the courts of other jurisdictions. So that might be in France or in the UK or in Spain or in Italy. Now, as many of you who have a criminal law background will be aware, there are a number of bases of jurisdiction on which this can be done. Interestingly, it's becoming more and more possible because of the refugee outflow. The people coming out of Syria both contain a huge potential store of evidence themselves, because they could be witnesses to violations or hold documentation which can be useful in bringing together cases, but also perpetrators are coming out, both from opposition fighters and also from the government side. And I was in Sweden a couple of weeks ago, where there is quite a number of Syrian refugees, and there are going to be quite a number of cases coming forward. They have something like 150 cases under investigation at the moment, 10 going to trial. And in a country like Germany, for example, which has a very, very large number of Syrian refugees now, there are going to be a lot of potential cases.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions at this point or comments? Okay, I mean, in a way that leads quite nicely into our next question, which is about, as commercial lawyers, what can we do to sort of work in this area? I mean, it's clearly a criminal area, and we've touched on the kind of research work and development of apps and research on the criminal court systems and that kind of thing. But what other ways can commercial lawyers, at their desks in London or actually out in the field, how can they really buy into and get involved with these kind of projects? I mean, Mark, actually, I don't know if you want to just carry on a little bit, because I know that there's a second phase to the project that we did the research on, and you might want to say about that.
Yes, I mean, if the question is what can a commercial lawyer do in this field, I mean, you mentioned that, I mean, our project is mostly about potential criminal cases. Most human rights litigation, of course, is civil litigation. But there are a lot of human rights lawyers, and increasingly NGOs have human rights lawyers working for them. Some of them have a criminal law background. A lot of them are now are lawyers in sort of academic lawyers. They will have LLMs, but they might not actually be practicing or have a lot of practical experience. And I think, having seen that the profession, the human rights profession, seriously professionalize over the last 10 years, you're aware that a lot of human rights lawyers are now working for, in-house for NGOs, but they don't often have the range of skills that you might need, and certainly they won't have the range of legal experience you might want. I mean, someone who has, an LLM in human rights law, has written some academic papers on human rights, doesn't actually feel like the same beast as someone who has worked for even just for sort of 3 years in a corporate law firm. And actually the hands-on experience, whether it's in contract, certainly in civil litigation, but also just in standards of legal documentation, is hugely valuable. And often I'm kind of surprised sometimes by what some of the, of course not in my organisation because they're all perfect, but in sometimes when you meet lawyers working for NGOs, while I'm always impressed by their knowledge strictly on some international human rights law questions, I can be often surprised by how little they might know about, just about tort law, for example.
Thank you. Susan, do you want to follow up on that?
Well, I think there's a role for the litigators. I do think there's a role for sharing best practice in terms of court cases, which, as you rightly say, the human rights lawyers generally are the experts in the particular subject matter, but will not necessarily have the same knockabout experience of advocacy. So quite a lot of the support we give to NGOs is around bringing that additional knowledge and expertise. The area, litigators, if you're in a US firm, they form quite a big part of the firm, but actually most of the lawyers in commercial law firms are going to be transactional lawyers. So I think it's thinking about how you use their skills. I'm actually a great believer in not getting people to retool as human rights lawyers. People have spent years perfecting their expertise in a particular commercial area. Well, is there some way to use that? So that little list I went through in terms of the work we were doing in Liberia, that in every instance is saying to people, well, fantastic, you know about money laundering or corruption, or you know about how to negotiate a contract, or could you renegotiate this contract? This contract was signed just after the conflict ended, and everything was in disarray, and a terribly disadvantageous contract has been signed up, which can have profoundly negative implications for that country for decades to come. Maybe you could renegotiate that contract. Maybe you could sit down. So I think there's a wealth of interventions that commercial lawyers can make, which doesn't require them to suddenly become something that they aren't, but just to go, okay, no, you've got fantastically valuable skills which are in very short supply, which would be really appreciated and would make a profound difference.
Thank you. Wendy?
So we have anticipated the use of pro bono attorneys in this next phase of the project all the way through. And the idea is that the attorneys who are on this roster for reviewing the footage don't need to be experts in criminal law, don't need to be litigators. We will be looking for very specific things. We have human rights lawyers on staff who will guide that process. But I can't undersell the importance of performing that sort of legal curation, triage, summarization, analysis component. As important as the verification aspect of this project is, and the Eyewitness App as the front-end tool, there's really a capacity problem in the courts to deal with the amount of footage that is generated. So, for example, I spoke with a prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. He told me that just for one case before the court, they have 6,000 pieces of video footage. They just don't have the capacity to review that kind of information. And if you look at YouTube, for Syria alone, there's been more than 1 million videos posted. So it's a great scope of information. And by being able to review it, curate it, triage it, and sort it for the investigators and the courts, you're really honoring the risk that people have taken to capture this footage, to make sure that it's not going unused. So I would put out a shameless plea at this point that if any of your firms might be interested in participating with this aspect of the project with us, please let me know, because we are very eager to have as many individuals as possible involved in this effort with us.
Thank you. I really would like to hear a bit more from the audience. Would anyone like to come in at this point? Any, there's a lady at the back, thank you.
Thank you. About the fact that transactional lawyers don't need to be experts in litigation, I'd like to say that I saw, working in a big commercial firm in the States, a number of transactional lawyers taking up asylum cases. The teams, it's never one lawyer, it's a team of lawyers. So I don't think necessarily that also on the pro bono side there should be the division that there is on the inside the law firm. Meaning transactional lawyers are only going to do transactional stuff and litigators are only going to do litigation because you're going to lose some people who might be interested in doing something, and there are the skills inside of the law firm to actually involve those people and make them good at that.
Thank you, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, transferable skills, yeah, they are what we have in droves, so good point, thank you. Anybody else? No, okay. I'd just like to, I don't know if anybody caught the news this morning before breakfast, but we are right in the thick of it in terms of Syria. So overnight, there was a US missile attack targeting Jihadi John, and the US claim that they think they got him, but it's not confirmed yet. At the same time, the Peshmerga are pushing to retake Sinjar. Russia are trying to verify video evidence from ISIS, claiming that they're going to attack Russian interests. And the Valletta Summit, which was agreed last Thursday, which is a 1.8 billion euro emergency trust fund for agreed with African nations. There's been some extra information given about that and what what that's going to do. So there's a lot going on, and I wonder whether it's a question for the panel from me really. In the thick of all this, is law now the answer, or are we wasting our time really? It's something that Mark touched on earlier. Should we be waiting until the political process has sort of run its course? I appreciate with Syria that might take a very, very long time, but really, as lawyers, are we jumping in too soon? Is what we can do meaningless really in the face of the other interventions? Anybody? I don't mind who goes first.
Well, everyone's looking at me, so my own organisation, the Ceasefire Centre for Civilian Rights, is partly based on this idea that if we leave conflicts just to the fighters, they're just going to go on and on and on. Law is actually really society's main way of resolving disputes peacefully, whether it's keeping order in the criminal law context or particularly in the civil law context of dispute resolution. Law is the main alternative that societies have to violent conflict. And it seems to me that is never more necessary than in situations of violent conflict. So, maybe Jihadi John Mohammed Mwazi has been killed overnight. Even better if he'd been brought before a court. And the families of his victims actually saw justice happening, and he was forced to account, or at least someone held him to account for what he did. But there is a proliferation of questions, they're partly legal questions, in any conflict. I was in Iraq a couple of occasions last year when many of the Yazidi refugees from Sinjar had just arrived. I did sort of visits around all those refugee camps on behind the front line, and I said to many of them, can you imagine going back? And most of them said, we can't ever go back, because it's not just ISIS. It was all our neighbours who betrayed us, who are now occupying our houses, who are now occupying our lands. And that question, the question about how they get restitution of their lands, how, we're talking to some of the Iraqi authorities about a commission for compensation, for reparations, for restitution of property, how that process is managed, how all those claims are lodged, how a process of restitution can be fair, are all questions that need to be grounded in some legal process, in some process where the rights of victims can be defended. And that, it seems to me, is a prerequisite for any kind of longer-term solution to the conflict. So my answer, as you might expect, is absolutely. You can't just postpone law in situations of war. You have to make sure that it enters as soon as possible to try and draw some of the sting from the conflict.
I'll let Wendy come in next.
Just an observation from the number of groups that I've spoken with in various conflict zones who are actively involved with documenting what's happening, trying to raise awareness, across the board have been very hungry for information on how to better use the law. They don't understand how it is that they've collected this information. They don't understand how it is that they've told people what's going on, but yet nothing's being done. And so they've asked repeatedly for information on how they access these legal institutions, what do they need to be doing better. So I think even as conflict is going on, there's a lot of space for assistance from the legal profession.
Thank you. Susan, anything to add?
20 seconds. So one in-country thing you could do, lots of NGOs trying to get cash into the countries. Syria, a great example, sanctions. How do they get around those? Commercial lawyers can really help those NGOs navigate those financial issues. And one out of country, there's often money flows out. Often conflicts are around natural resources. There are people making money out of those natural resources. Follow the cash. See if you can follow the people who are in that chain who are making money of it. That if you can dry up the cash sources, you often can have a real impact on the conflict.
Thank you. We do have to finish a little early because the security people need to come in and sweep for the next panel. So I would just like to ask you to thank my panel in the usual way. I think they've been wonderful and I hope you found it very interesting today. And thank you to you all as well.